The Oregon Ducks did not end 2025 on a high note in a 30-point loss to the Indiana Hoosiers. However, Indiana was a team of destiny last season. They won the national championship. Oregon still had a very impressive season, and now, after this offseason, is looking to make another run towards securing their first national title. Now, a recap of 2025. Our early projection was 9.4 wins for the Ducks. We actually predicted them to go 11-1. Their actual final record was 13-2. They did go 11-1 in the regular season. So just overall, I think we're pretty accurate with Oregon. And based on what they've done this offseason, they have a really good chance to repeat that in 2026.
And the big storyline is who they have returning. The biggest news was the return of starting quarterback Dante Moore, who instead of going to the NFL and being arguably the number two overall draft pick, he decided to return to the Ducks. And while that might be a little bit of concern for someone like Dylan Raiola, who transferred in and expecting to be the starter, I think it is going to be for the best for the Ducks. And I think Dante Moore was one of the best quarterbacks in college football last season. They also return a couple of their key wide receivers, including Evan Stewart also coming back. He was dealing with some injuries, but he was a starter 2 years ago on that team that did go undefeated until they ran into Ohio State at the Rose Bowl. So I do think weapons wise, they will be fairly good. They are losing their number one running back, but their number two running back, who was a true freshman, did just as good as the number one running back. So they will be just fine there. And then offensive line is losing a couple people, but still, for the most part, is intact. And then defensively is where they're getting a lot of returning production. The entire defensive line is essentially back. The only major losses for this defense is Bryce Botcher on the linebacker and Dylan Thieneman, who was their starting safety. But they did address those concerns or some of those concerns in the transfer portal. Speaking of the recruiting classes, they have the number three overall high school recruiting class, and that makes sense considering how popular Oregon is as a program. Transfer portal is only number 25, and I think that's mostly due to the fact that they do have a relatively small transfer portal class, only 12 incoming transfers, but still fairly solid, and that's why it comes out to an overall ranking at number 7. Now, the top additions that I think are going to make a huge impact for this team, Aaron Scott Jr. is joining that secondary from Ohio State. I think he will be much needed in this secondary that's not necessarily losing most of the secondary, but is still going to need one guy that can maybe rotate in or maybe even get a start. I think Andrew Olish as their new starting tight end from Penn State is going to be a big weapon for them to utilize, especially since Kenyon Sadiq was the best tight end in college football last season. I think Olish is just the next guy up. And then the biggest signing for them that will make an instant impact is Coy Parrish from Minnesota, the two-way player, but predominantly will be used as a starting safety to replace Thieneman. And then they also bring in a very highly recruited offensive lineman in Emmanuel Inacho. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but I do think with some departures on that offensive line, he can work his way into that starting role. And we've seen Oregon have lots of success with young offensive linemen. I think he will just be the next one in line. Now, grades wise, talent, it's going to be an A, even though it is a smaller class. They're bringing in a lot of highly talented recruits and transfer portal acquisitions. But needs wise, it's only going to be an A minus. Now, they did address most of those needs, but the two ones that I was kind of surprised they didn't get anything for was running back, even though they don't really need a starting running back, but I'm just surprised they didn't get anyone as a depth piece. But really, the biggest one I was surprised they didn't go out and get was a linebacker because Bryce Botcher was such a focal point of this defense. He was this leader of this defense, and I'm just surprised with someone like I'm blanking on his name all of a sudden, but the Pitt linebacker that ended up going to Texas. I'm just surprised Oregon didn't make a stronger push for him because I think he would have been a very happy addition to this Ducks defense. But overall, it's going to be an A minus for the offseason grades, but that doesn't mean Oregon doesn't have a phenomenal team that can easily make the college football playoffs and maybe be the Big Ten champs once again.
Looking at their schedule, overall, there's some really tough games on here. Oklahoma State early on is sneaky. They will not be the pushover that they were last year. I'll get into that more in a sec. Road trips to USC and Ohio State, also very difficult, along with the home game against Michigan. Now, Boise State, they've been solid in the group of five the past few years, but they're not going to beat Oregon. The Ducks will win this game at home, 100% chance. Then it's that road trip to Oklahoma State. Now, Oklahoma State absolutely crushed the transfer portal, and it's a lot of North Texas guys. And normally, that still takes a while for teams to kind of figure out playing on a new roster. But they followed their head coach, and the biggest thing here that makes me think Oklahoma State can actually be good is Drew Mestemaker, one of the best quarterbacks in the transfer portal. He was the guy who took over for Chandler Morris. We saw what Morris did at Virginia. And now with Mestemaker going to Oklahoma State, on top of them having a top 10 transfer portal class, I really think that the Cowboys are going to make a comeback in the Big 12. They've been at the bottom of the conference for the past couple of years. And I wouldn't completely count them out of this game against Oregon. Really early on in the season, this is the type of upset that nobody would expect to happen. Now, we do still think Oregon's going to be favored. They should win that game, but don't take it completely out of the question that Oklahoma State could pull off an absolute shocker. And then they'll be back home to face Portland State. I'm pretty sure they dropped 80 points on them the last time they played. So, understandably, this one's going to sit right there at 100% as well.
They open up Big Ten play with a road trip to USC. And I think this is going to be somewhat interesting because USC does return the starting quarterback in Jaden Maiava. And this game was close for a little bit last season, but then Oregon started to pull away towards the end. And I think the big determining factor here is just what USC has lost, and that's their dominant wide receiver room. Jacoby Lane and Makai Lemon were some of the best wide receivers in the country last season. And with them moving on to the NFL, I have some concerns with this offense. I don't think it's going to be absolutely horrible because USC is a top destination for wide receivers, but I don't think they will be nearly as explosive as they were last season. And I think Oregon's defense, with that amount of starting production returning, is going to be able to keep Maava in check. And then they have a bye week before taking on UCLA at home. And obviously, Nico Imaleva's first year as a Bruin did not really go according to plan. You know, you had a couple memorable moments like that upset over Penn State. But I don't really anticipate UCLA really breaking through just yet. Maybe they start to play a little bit better and maybe win a couple more games this season compared to last year. But I still think Oregon is the absolute juggernaut that they are, more talented than what UCLA has, and are just going to bully them off the field in a pretty dominant win. And then Nebraska at home. That's going to be a little bit of a tough road trip for the Cornhuskers. Obviously, Autzen Stadium is one of the toughest stadiums to play at in all of college football. We've seen it time and time and again. And I think this Nebraska team is going to see a good amount of regression next season with Dylan Raiola now at Oregon. So a little bit of a revenge game there for Raiola. But I do think this Nebraska team's offense is going to struggle a little bit with the departures that they've had in the transfer portal or to the NFL. And once again, I just think Oregon is the more talented team and has way more playmakers on both sides of the ball to limit whatever Nebraska is going to try and do in this game. Throw in the fact that it's at home, I think the Ducks are going to cruise once again.
Now, going on the road to face Illinois, the Fighting Illini are not going to be quite as good as they were last season. They lost their starting quarterback. Just he ended up graduating, ran out of eligibility, and was unable to file for a waiver like some guys, such as TJ Finley, who have transferred 7 seasons. Now, Illinois, I do think is still going to be a solid team next year. Just overall, they don't have the level of talent to match up with Oregon. This game wouldn't have been competitive in 2025. I think the talent gap got even bigger this next season. So 2026, fully expect the Ducks to go on the road and win that game. Northwestern at home could be slightly interesting. Northwestern brought in Aiden Childs from Michigan State, and he's just struggled with turnovers a lot. If he has the game of his life, Northwestern can maybe keep it somewhat close. We saw last year they kept it surprisingly close with the Ducks, although that was at their makeshift home stadium. I think that Oregon this season should be able to get a win. We're pretty confident in that, sitting it at 90%. And then, arguably their biggest game of the season, a road trip to Columbus. This one by no means will be easy. Ohio State is returning a lot of production, specifically on their offense, bringing back Julian Sayin and Jeremiah Smith, two of the best players in the country. Their running back, Bo Jackson, and most of that offensive line, those guys are just going to continue to develop, and it's going to be a scary offense led by their new offensive coordinator, Arthur Smith. On the defensive side of the ball, they had the best defensive coordinator in the country in Matt Patricia, who led the Buckeyes to the number one defense. They had to replace a lot of that talent, only bringing back four starters. But this Ohio State team is still going to be very good. They should have a top defense once again, especially with the guys they brought in the transfer portal. The Ducks are going to be slight underdogs in this one in our minds, but just barely sitting at 45%.
For that, what better way to follow up taking on Ohio State than taking on their arch rival in the Michigan Wolverines? Now, the Ducks do get this game at home. But this is going to be another really tough game for them because I do think the coaching changes that the Wolverines have had this offseason are going to benefit them immensely. I think bringing in Kyle Whittingham is going to be huge to unlocking Bryce Underwood's full potential. I think there are similarities between the play style of Underwood and Devin Dampier last year at Utah. And I do think this is going to be the best supporting cast that Bryce Underwood has had. And defensively, it's a Michigan defense that is good year in and year out and brings in BYU's defensive coordinator. And BYU has had a very, very good defense the last few years as well. So I do think that this Michigan team will take some steps forward, and I don't think they will be nearly as one-dimensional as they were last season. It's a tall ask to say that the Wolverines are going to go into Autzen Stadium right after a really emotional game, whether it's a win or a loss on the road against Ohio State for the Ducks, and somehow find a way to beat the Ducks. But I do think it's a possibility. It's a little too early to tell because we don't know how this Michigan offense is going to function with its new leadership. But I do think it's pretty easy to say that this game could get very competitive after the first few weeks of the season progress. We are going to favor the home team here with the Ducks just because they do have that continuity at quarterback and so much of that defense returning as well. The last game or the last two games of the season are a little bit easier. The first one is a road trip to Michigan State, a little bit far of a road trip, but Michigan State doesn't have a whole lot going for them with Aiden Childs and Nick Marsh transferring out. Aiden Childs to Northwestern and Nick Marsh to Indiana. Those two were the focal point of their offense, and I really don't know what Sparty's going to be able to do without either of them. I think they will be stuck in a rut and might be one of the worst teams in the Big Ten next season. So I anticipate that the Ducks will get a pretty easy win here, but it is a road game, so it's only going to be at 80%. And then Washington to cap off their season. Now, Washington had a pretty interesting offseason considering the whole Demond Williams situation, where he entered the transfer portal and the Huskies essentially said, "You can't go anywhere." And essentially, it ended up being they forced him to come back. So I don't know what the relationship is like between the two. I think since Demond Williams ended up deciding to come back, maybe it's a little bit more amicable than some people might think it is. But other than that, I think the roster is not going to be as good as it was last year when we thought Washington had some dark horse potential. I think the loss of some of their running backs and wide receivers is going to limit this offense a little bit. And then defensively, kind of the same thing. I anticipate that this is still going to be a pretty competitive game because it is a rivalry game between these two schools. But once again, Oregon's team has just been one of the most talented teams year in and year out over the last few years since joining the Big Ten. And I think they're the more talented team here and should be favored by a little bit against the Huskies at home. So overall, just a pretty easy schedule for the Ducks outside of those back-to-back games against the Buckeyes and Wolverines.
which is going to lead to us having the same prediction as we did last season and for Oregon to have the same record as last year, going 11 and 1. Now the projection is a little bit lower down there at 9.1 wins, likely due to the fact that, Ohio State and Michigan, those add up to having one expected loss. Throw everything else in there, you got USC, Washington, Oklahoma State. It all just adds up and you end up around almost three losses. Personally, I would be pretty surprised if the Ducks lost more than two games. 10 and 2 is definitely possible though, but I feel really confident, especially with Dante Moore coming back, that they should be able to hit this 11 and 1 mark. And Vegas is very similar. They have the Ducks as the number 5 team in national championship odds, sitting at plus 950 to win it all in 2026. So, thank you guys for watching. Please make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in our next video.